there, I'm Mary Clark, and I'd like to welcome you to this module of the series about the board journey. And this module is called Activating Your Network or Letting the Right People Know. It's from the piece about getting on a board. We're going to do something different in this session than we've done in some of the others. We're doing a case study. And this is a case study that began almost 3 years ago. We had this thought that we'd like to try and figure out how could we accelerate the progress of someone getting on the board from Stanford Women on Boards. So since we were doing kind of a test, we wanted to have the best results possible. So we did a careful search of our entire member database to try and find a person who was ready to get on a board from the standpoint of operating experience, who had quickly recognizable credentials, and who had the interest to put the time in to what it takes to actually do all the work to get on a board. And we picked a woman named June Yang, and this is June. So I became June's mentor, and we spent over a year talking every other Sunday to understand June and what she brought to the board, and to make a plan, and then to start executing the plan. So June, why don't you take a minute and introduce yourself now?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is June Yang. I am delighted to be here. Thank you very much, Mary, for the invitation. So currently, I'm serving on 3 boards with a total of about 5 years of board experience. Compared to Mary's experience, I'm very much a newbie and a baby on this. So currently, I'm serving on the board of UiPath, which is a public technology company focused on AI-powered automation platform for enterprises, and SRS Distribution, which is a large private company that's backed by a couple of PE firms, and their focus is building product distribution. And then finally, Cradles to Crayons, which is the nonprofit organization that's really providing clothing and other essential needs for children. So that's kind of a little bit of my board experience, and I was very happy when Stanford Women on Board called me and asked if I was interested. I definitely jumped that opportunity to be mentored by Marie, and you hear a lot more about our experiences together on this.
So just to give you some context, for me, I was a founder of Stanford Women on Boards 15 years ago, and was starting to serve on boards then, but was still very much in a new position myself, although I had done some not-for-profit and other boards. So altogether, I have 93 years of board experience, if you can imagine. That's counting each board for every year that I was on it. Today, I serve on the board of a public company called Ally Financial Services, which is the largest digital bank in the country. One called Deutsche Bank, which is one of the largest European banks. I serve on the board of the German parent. And a company called Allview Systems, which is owned by a private equity firm called Vista Equity Partners. And I also serve on 2 non-for-profits, and that's been a pattern to be serving on both corporate and nonprofit boards. I want to say, before we get started, the session we're about to do is applicable to nonprofits, private corporate companies, and also to public company boards. There are important modules before this one. The first is, what do boards do? And this is a module that's kind of in the middle of our series. And I want to make sure that before you dive into what we're doing here, that you take the time to do the work that is talked about in other modules. So the first module is an introduction to the entire board journey. The second one talks about what boards do. You must get through the business of what boards do before you really try and get on, right? And there's one on not-for-profits, and there's one on corporates. The next one is so helpful, I think. It's a self-assessment. It gives you the chance to go through and see, what am I ready for? And you definitely want to do that before you take the leap to get started. And then the one immediately prior to this is called preparing the board bio. And that puts you in a position so you have something to talk about when you get ready to activate your network, which is what we're going to start today. Okay, so let's get started with June's board journey. June, how did you decide you wanted to be on a board?
It was a bit of a surprise. So one day I got a call from an executive recruiting firm, and who was asking me if I was interested in board. At the time, board just, what seems like such a remote, thing to me. So I didn't know much about it. And this was for a Fortune 500 company. And I was quite surprised they called me. And so I asked, hey, how did you get my name? and they mentioned that they actually did an interesting thing as part of this board search. They didn't want to just go to the existing sort of population of board members they know about. So they actually went to a number of tech company CEOs and asked about who are the up and coming people in your organization that could be ready for board. And so they called Pat Gelsinger, who was the VMware CEO at the time, currently the Intel CEO, and he gave them my name as a potential candidate. So that's how they reached out to me. And I went through the process, and I knew very little about board at the time. So while I didn't get the position, but it definitely piqued my interest, and I was ready to kind of look into board and figure out what's the board about and what it takes to kind of get on the board. So I reached out to some of my friends who are in this area, and one of them recommended for me to join the Stanford Women on Board program. So I joined SWB in 21, and I started kind of looking at kind of the suitable openings and so forth. So I applied to one of them, a technology company, and actually went quite far. But in the end, I had to withdraw because there was a conflict of interest with Google, since Google is in many, many businesses. So that's something that I wasn't kind of fully aware of. And so when Marie reached out to me about the potential to kind of do this case study together, I definitely jumped on the opportunity and wanted to get all the help that I could on this front here.
So as I mentioned, June was ready for board work, and she'll describe her operating experience in a separate session that we'll do about our board journeys. But she had significant operating experience. She would have ticked all the boxes in the self-assessment. She had been operated as a skip level to CEO in a major organization. So she's the type of person where a board could see what she could contribute. So why don't we talk about the process of just getting started, June?
Yeah. So I think I have to say, coming sort of fresh, right? The whole board process was very opaque. I wasn't really sure how to get started. Everyone says about, hey, you should activate your network. But I was a little bit lost as to like, how do we get started? Who do I talk to? What do I say? Right? I think all the same questions you probably have today. So Marie and I worked together, and Marie suggested that we should start with preparing a list of target companies, and on the target companies, and really thinking about what is the profile of the company that would be suitable for me, and why would I be a good candidate for them, and what do I bring to the table, and what would excite for me. So those are kind of things I would say in the first part of our journey that we spend quite a bit of time just kind of brainstorming and thinking through. Maybe anything you want to add to that?
Well, I would say that actually I asked you to do that because I just knew that it would get her thinking about what she could do. And even though we knew that we might target the companies and not get there, just the process of itself, I think, is really helpful. And what I suggested you do is that she pick something that would be a real stretch, kind of like getting into Stanford, but also pick some safety schools in effect. Pick some where she really thought she could add, but they weren't so high profile, and it was more likely that she could get a footing, and where she might know somebody.
Yeah, so I think we went through this process and quite iteratively. And so in the end, I ended up with really two categories of companies, and your profile companies will be different based on your own skills and experiences. So the first category was really technology companies. That's probably the more obvious category. And within that, I was really interested in company that's still very much in the growth phase and looking to scale rapidly. And these are, things in terms of growing their existing portfolio, scaling the team, go-to-market routes, and so forth. Things that I have done time and time again, have significant experience. The challenge in this category was finding a company that doesn't have conflict of interest with Google and Google Cloud, since the Google's in a lot of different businesses. The second category of companies profile I picked was probably less obvious. What I was interested in was more in traditional companies looking for digital transformation. This is something that I have done time and time again, both at VMware and Google, and really to help traditional companies thinking about how they can adopt cloud, how they can adopt AI, how they can adopt technology to help them to be more differentiated. And so this, the second category, definitely opened up an aperture quite a bit in terms of looking at potential candidates over there. So this is something that Marie and I, as well as the MBA associate Swati, we work together, really on a biweekly basis, and really brainstorm and iterate it, and try to refine what the profile looks like. The way I think about it is that in product management, you talk about product market fit, right? In this case, you're also doing that. I am the product. I'm looking for a market that would be a suitable fit for my profile and my interest.
So one thing we realized along the way was that June didn't actually have any experience that was like board experience. She'd never been on a not-for-profit board or, involved with a trade association or something like that. And it struck me that was something that would really help her be better in the business of finding the board, and it would also be something that would be good for the world. So we then started on a not-for-profit list.
Yeah, so I mean, we did a similar process for the nonprofit, looking for the target. And I was looking for, thinking through sort of causes that I am personally passionate about. So for me, one was for children, to really help children in need. And then second is to advance underrepresented groups in technology. So these are things that I was doing already on the side. Now I was looking for kind of where I can add value to a nonprofit organization, not only through financial support, but also through support of my experiences, where I can, add more unique experiences there.
Okay, so now we have the target list of companies and organizations, we should say. Shall we talk about what came next?
Yeah, definitely. So I think we took a pretty systematic approach, right? It's really a two-pronged approach. One is to, kind of really look at, with the target list of companies, we actually went through and looked up all the board members for that particular company and noted any particular, GSB connections or, Stanford connections and so forth. And then, so one part was really proactively reaching out to these board members of these target companies. And then the second was to get on the radar of executive recruiting firms. So on the first prong to, proactive reach out to board members of target company, Mary introduced me to Jeff Epstein, who is a former CEO, CFO of Oracle, who is also part of the Stanford Women on Board leadership teams. And Jeff and Marie actually went through the target company list and identified, who they know from their own Rolodexes and started making introductions for me. And in the meantime, I also started looking, reaching out in my own network, looking at friends and colleagues who are board members or who are, in the venture capital or PE firms who are well connected. And that's kind of one part of the, the equation here. The second prong was to get on the radar of executive recruiting firm. So here, again, Mary made a couple of different introductions. And, and for me, I had a lot of companies reaching out to me, a lot of the recruiting firm reaching out to me for full-time opportunities. While I wasn't interested in the full-time opportunity, I always responded to them to say, hey, I'm not interested for full-time, but I am open for board and advisory positions. So if something comes up, please let me know. So I think both of those are, really ways to be able to get my interest out there and letting the right people know that, there is a candidate who is interested in board and, so that's kind of sort of how we got started.
Let me just say that the executive recruiters, they work for the companies, right? So, so you can never think that you can depend on them to help you get on a board. It's just not that's not what they're supposed to do. But it's good to have them know who you are. And there are specialists within the recruiting firms that focus on boards. So if you're already, established with some recruiters, you can ask them to, to introduce you to the people within their firm that are looking at boards. And, when you talk to them, nothing's going to happen right away unless they happen to have something that's a match, but you'll be in their database, and that can be useful later on.
Yeah, so as these introductions were made, I started, talking to a lot of different people who are, current or past board members. And I think of these discussions really, I think of them as really informational interviews, right? And it's a way for me to get to know them and for them to get to know me. And I think it's not every day that you get to talk to such well accomplished individuals. And I definitely learned quite a bit along the way from their wisdom and past experiences. I think all in all, I probably had 30 to 40 discussion over the course of a number of months. And often, when I talk to one person, they will say, hey, this other person, great for you to talk to as well. So it becomes a little bit of a chain reaction. Then you start talking to more and more people there. Every once in a while, I get to introduce to multiple members for the same board, the same company. And Marie actually was very gave me the great advice to really make sure that, keep everybody in the loop and be very transparent in terms of who I'm talking to and so forth.
Yeah, because those were situations where I think those companies weren't even looking for a director, but you just happened to keep getting, introduced, which was fantastic, right? But you want to keep, you don't want anybody to think you're not cognizant of their board, who's on their board, how it's working.
Yeah. And then I think as these discussions start happening, and then the momentum start to build. Firms start reaching out to me about potential board opportunities, and I interviewed with multiple companies. I learned a lot in this process, and I think got better along the way, and through the interview process. And I know there's another module to talk more about the interview process here, so I won't belabor the point here.
But the most important point from that is that you have to both be chosen, but you have to choose the right thing. And so the next module will be very much about making the choice. And June turned some things down. And at least a couple of them, I think I was telling her, don't do that one, or think about doing something like that later. For one reason or another, it was great, I think, for her to have a lot of interviewing experience, but not each one would have been a good fit or a good starting point.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the pearls of wisdom throughout this journey I learned was, the board is a long-term commitment, right? Usually you're committed to a board for, anywhere from 7 to 10 years. So it's a long-term marriage. So you really want to make sure that you're getting into the right board with the right people that you'll be happy with. So in terms of kind of, so sort of, outcomes, right? Later that year, after Mary and I started working together, I joined the board for Cradles to Crayons, which is the nonprofit organization. Mary introduced me to Cradles to Crayons, and who are looking to really, add digital experience to complement their existing physical experience. Where it's something that I can add value to. So I felt really good about not only be able to provide, financial and other support, but also be able to provide, sort of my experience, my expertise in that particular area. Shortly thereafter, I joined the advisory board for a PE firm, Brighton Park Capitals. And that was actually, through one of the introduction meetings. A few months later, one of the recruiting firms, I reached out to earlier, reached out to me about SRS, which is a large private equity-backed private company. And, I went through the interview process and really liked the people and where they're going. One of the board members I interviewed with, actually knew Cradle to Crayons and has been, have been volunteered there for a number of years. So I think it's a small world in this. And I joined SRS board at the end of 2022. Then earlier this year, I joined the board of UiPath, and that's my first public company board.
So I want you to really talk about how that one came about. Yeah.
Yeah. So UiPath was actually on my target list of tech companies. If we go back a little bit, right, when we talked about the initial target company profile, this was high on my list. And during the reach out phase, I had spoken to a couple of the board members on UiPath. At the time, there wasn't any opening, but I think I left a positive impression. At the same time, I think a couple, like over the course of the last couple of years, my colleague Rob Enslin, who was at Google Cloud with me, we worked together. He joined UiPath as a co-CEO. And the board was looking for, people with AI and product expertise, which really is a perfect fit for my profile. So I think the star really aligned up, for me to become a, member of UiPath. And so I joined that a little bit earlier this year.
Yeah. So, the learnings from that, I think, are so much that, warm introductions made a difference, and she kept getting introduced. And then, it started to kind of hang together. Boards like to have a trusted source when they're being introduced to somebody who can kind of vouch for your ability to get along with the board and be right in the boardroom, as well as how you look on paper. I found myself that I've never gone on a board where somebody didn't vouch for me, besides just a recruiter finding me. And so June's experience, I think, is just a wonderful way to see how you get started and then how you go with it. I'm going to let June make some closing thoughts, and then I'll have the last word, if that's okay.
Sounds good. So I'll do a quick recap of the timeline, right? And I think people talk about, the process of kind of getting on board does take a while, and I think in my case that's true as well. I mean, I think in late 20, that's when I first got exposed to the board idea, and I joined SWB in 2021 and started kind of applying to open searches and so forth. And it was pretty ad hoc kind of a process. By mid 2021, that's when I got guided, when I got connected with Mary, and we started approaching this in a much more systematic manner and be much more proactive to kind of getting the names out there and getting on board. By late 2021, that's when I joined the nonprofit board. And early 2022 is when I joined advisory board for the PE firm. And then by late 2022 is when I joined the SRS, the private company board. And then finally, earlier this year, really early 2024 is when I joined my first public company board. So all in all, I mean, it is a long elapsed kind of a time. So I think, part of the learning is that you need to have tenacity, right? I think there's a phrase that people often overestimate what they can do in the short run, but underestimate what they can do in the long run. While the elapsed time of this is, a few years, right? A couple years. But the actual time I spent is actually not that much. I think, generally, I don't think I spend more than an hour or two in any given week. After the initial push to get, let people know, pretty much I didn't really do much. I just was waiting for the opportunity to kind of come up. And so it can be sort of, a little bit frustrating to say, hey, things are not moving, even if I'm doing all the work. You do need to keep at it and keep the ball rolling and, trust that the momentum and things will come together. The second thing I would say is that, really enjoy the process and enjoy the introduction meetings, right? You're talking to really well-accomplished people, and by the fact that they're taking a call from you, and usually they don't know you, right? And they're already showing the willingness to be able to help and to kind of as part of the giving back. And so I think what I find is that the more I enjoy it, the more authentic I am, the better the connection that you actually make. So that's something that I think you guys can think about it. And then, finally, I just really, feel a lot of gratitude, right? I'm really grateful for SWB for providing this platform and this community. And Marie, I was fortunate enough to be paired with Marie, who just really have been my mentor and guide throughout this entire process. And Jeff Epstein for really just making many, many, introductions to really kind of help me to kind of do the reach out. And, many others in SWB along the way to really help me to and inspire me and to continue on this journey. So I feel really fortunate to be where I am today, and I hope to be able to give back as well.
Thank you, June. Those were very kind words about all of us. I would just say, as I mentioned at the outset, this was kind of an experiment, right? And we had this hypothesis that if we went about this systematically, it could make a difference. And I think it turned out to be exactly right. And the idea also was in doing the experiment was if we figured out how to do it systematically, then we could scale it. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this by video right now, because this takes an enormous amount of time for the person doing it and also for the mentor. And we wanted to see if we couldn't just scale that mentorship, if you will. Not all parts of it, but certainly the basics for how you get started and how you go with it. So, I think my final just piece of advice is just make sure you're ready. As June just mentioned, you're going to be spending time with high-powered people. They're busy. They're taking some moments out for you. And if you show up and you're really not right, you're probably not going to get a do-over. So take the time to go through these early modules, do all these things to really get yourself in a position to be successful. If you are prepared, don't get discouraged, just stay at it. You will get better as you go. And as June pointed out, it takes time. It's taken time for all of us. Everybody you're going to hear on these, on all these 10 modules, it's taken time to get on the board. We've done this, again, because we think organizations deserve strong boards with strong directors. So keep watching. In the next set of modules, you're going to learn more about the business of choosing and being chosen in the interview process, what to do in your rookie year, how to be an outstanding board member, and then how to help make your board outstanding as well. So thanks for joining us today. See you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.